as such, let's begin. So I would like to invite first Professor Jimi Adesina from the University of South Africa to tell us about the nexus of development and social policy, breaking bread with Thandika Mkandawire. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I should start by apologizing that I'm not there with you in person. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. And can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. All right. My apologies that I'm not, there with you in person. Let me start off by saying that, at the heart of the late Professor Thandika Mkandawire scholarship is the concern with redressing Africa's development challenges. These concerns range from confronting the maldevelopment effects of neoliberalism in Africa to mapping the institutional guardrails for Africa's development and the developmental state efforts in Africa. Thandika turned to the nexus of development and social policy in the later part of his scholarly endeavors. In seeking to overcome the chasm between development literature and social policy scholarship, Mkandawire explored the interface of the development and social policy. The question that he asked was, what questions does a country or society ask of its social policy when it's concerned with the task of development? While grounded in the intrinsic and normative values of progressive social policy, Mkandawire explored the ways in which social policy facilitates development efforts, disabusing the idea of a trade-off between equity and growth, and advancing that historically late industrializers have been social policy pioneers. Out of this emerged the idea of transformative social policy. So what Mkandawire offered us was an expansive idea of development, and I'll come to that bit in a moment. And then a return to a wider vision of social policy against the prevailing tendency to reduce social policy to social protection. Mkandawire's idea of development is anchored on the classical notion of development. In other words, growth with structural transformation. And it goes on to make a distinction, especially in the context of the post-development scholarship and ideas, make a distinction between Bandung and Truman ideas of development. The Bandung vision of development, Mkandawire argued, is an emancipatory project with structural transformation, mastery over technology, strong manufacturing capacity, and so on and so forth. And this is generally anchored on a sovereign national project. Truman's, which is attributed to Harry Truman, idea of development serves as the moral premise for helping distant strangers. Catching up, and this is an idea that Thandika insisted upon. He argued requires that countries know themselves and their history that has set the initial conditions for any future progress. Development, he argues, requires learning from pioneers, but it's not mimicry. The knowledge imperative requires a considerable investment in institutions of knowledge production and of state capacity. This involves a sustained ecosystem of innovation and capacity to respond to a broad range of challenges. Within this framework, it is unimaginable to think of structural transformation and mastery of technology without strong and innovative manufacturing capacity. Thandika's idea of development and the development process and the developmental state is one that is also democratic, with an active and engaged citizenry. In terms of the wider concept of vision of social policy, as I argued, which contrasts with the prevailing dominant current tendency to reduce social policy to social protection. Thandika highlighted the imperative of understanding social policy in its multiple tasks. And here he emphasized four tasks. The production task of social policy, which is concerned with enhancement of the productive potential of members of society. The protection task, which is concerned with the protection of people from the vagaries of the market and changing circumstances of life. The redistribution task, which is concerned with the redistributive effect of economic policy. And the reproductive task, which is concerned, and he was very emphatic about this, about the reconciliation of the burden of reproduction with that of other social tasks, which anchors it on the gender imperative of social policy and redressing gender inequity. I have added a fifth task of social policy, which is that of enhancing social cohesion and nation building. Not only was this central in much of many post-colonial African contexts, Mkandawire himself will argue that some degree of social cohesion is necessary for the development process itself. And he emphasized the synergy between social policy and development, the imperative of that synergy in the process of structural transformation of economy and society. Social policy beyond a residual protection task is concerned with investment in human capital, attention to the production tasks of social policy, while at the same time insisting on the intrinsic and normative underpinning of social policy. In the context of what Irma Adelma, warned us about the natural tendency for growth, economic growth, to trickle up the benefit of growth. Social policy is intended, progressive social policy, to mitigate against this trickle up tendency. It's also important in mitigating against the socially disruptive impact of development, even in terms of the minimal Lewisian true sector models and this about movement of relocation of people from the low productivity sector to high productivity sector, and this, which often involve movement from urban to rural to urban areas, and the disruption of familial networks and so on and so forth. Social policy is concerned with mitigating this disruptive effect, and more significantly, is redressing gender inequities, which is the social reproduction task of social policy. The emphasis also involves the protection against the vagaries of market and the life cycle. An important dimension of the synergy, the nexus between social policy and development is one that is often easily overlooked, but the extent to which social policy, social funds that are intended for social protection tasks of social policy can in fact become sources of development finance. I highlight two examples of this. Although in the African context, we can look at the way in which marketing board surplus also becomes social fund for development financing. The example of Finland, for instance, the use of national pension funds in the 1950s for infrastructure development and the employment-related pension funds from the 1960s, which were invested for the country's industrialization. Equally important as an example is the Korean industrialization process, which was financed largely by, financed in part by public pension funds established in the 1960s, which were required to lend 90% of their funds to the National Investment Fund, which in turn lent to the development banks at significantly discounted rates. And the development banks then lent to targeted industries and for infrastructure development. This dimension of the nexus between social policy and social policy and development is the one that is easily overlooked. Let me end by framing the social transformative social policy in terms of the different components of it. A progressive transformative social policy, and its progressive nature is anchored on the normative framework of equality, advancing equality and solidarity. It highlights and emphasizes the multiple tasks of social policy and multidimensional nature of the deployment of social policy. It highlights the multiple policy instruments from education, health, human settlement, housing, agrarian reform, to labor market, affirmative action, family and child policy, care, old age policy, social insurance, and fiscal. And each of these can tap different aspects of social policy. So if you look at education, for instance, education will be concerned with building human capital, but it's also in the way in which it's organized. And I've used examples from Tanzania and Nigeria as an example of this. Can serve the function, the task of social cohesion and nation building. This in turn generates development outcomes of enhanced economic transformation, social transformation, political transformation, and in turn, the outcomes themselves tend to reinforce the norms of social policy, the normative framing of equality and solidarity. What is important to emphasize is that at the heart of the imperative of development underpinned by transformative social policy is Mwalimu Nyerere's pivotal idea of respect for human dignity. I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much also for respecting the time. So I would like now to invite Professor Adia Benton from Northwestern University to tell us about global health security, the right to health, and choiceless democracy. Thank you.
So I want to thank Grieve for this invitation to take part in this really wonderful conference. I am kind of in the midst of writing or finishing a book about the West African Ebola outbreak that lasted between 2014 to 2016. And a part of the work that I've been doing as an anthropologist has been to trace a bunch of what I guess might be called social policies and their relation to how people experience, respond to, and address outbreaks, including pandemics like that outbreak. So what I've been really appreciative of is having both Professor Adesina, and Professor Zeleza explaining what it means to talk about social policy and to take it seriously as a transformative option. I'm going to probably go in the opposite direction in terms of this question of global health security. It is not a transformative social policy, but something else that we should be thinking about. So I'll begin by talking about the Global Health Security Agenda, which I'm not sure how many people are familiar with it, but it was an agenda elaborated by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta in February 2014 that is supposed to help a range of countries, actually all countries, prevent, detect, and respond to what they call infectious disease threats. 70 countries signed on to the agenda, but it's of course not a binding agreement. But one of the reasons I explore this agenda is because I'm also in this book thinking about Atlanta as an imperial node in a broader network of diplomacy and how that's playing out in terms of shaping health policy. So the growing prominence of the GSA, which is what I'm calling the Global Health Security Agenda, within pandemic preparedness policy in the wake of that outbreak reanimated concerns about the pitfalls of a security approach to mass disease events. Chief among critical concerns is that an approach centers the economic and political interests of the West, while it also moves public health practice away from care, equity, and justice, and towards vigilance, defense, and control. The Global Health Security Agenda, as outlined in the country roadmap advanced by the US government and its partners, emphasizes elevating health security to high priority, focusing on strengthening event-based surveillance, building information systems, training the workforce to collect and monitor disease data, and integrating law enforcement into health roles. And in fact, if you look at the earliest documents, they are very clear about how to integrate, say, the military and the police into this. But they're also very, the way that it's framed is that an infectious disease threat in Africa or in Asia is a disease threat to the US and is a problem for national security. Now, one of the things that I think is very important to think about with the CDC is that it's largely a data management research organization. Did I say that? I shouldn't have said that. But one thing that I'm pointing this out because the way that I'm also going to be talking about this is it's a provocation for thinking about research and thinking about research from the bottom up to understand how security is, we can critique security not simply from a policy level, but from people's experiences. And so that laser focus on surveillance and data management, coupled with legal enforcement and regulatory frameworks, opens this policy up to all of this criticism. Yet a lot of the literature critiquing these policies relies heavily on policy texts, interviews with elites, and cursory site visits, which offer important insights about a policy's life cycle, but less about the everyday experiences with and human impacts of a security agenda in particular. So my research about Ebola and the subsequent COVID pandemic has suggested that an approach focused on everyday experience at varying scales may also elucidate some of these ideologies and impacts of health security in practice. So what does that look like? If we begin in August 2014, when the World Health Organization declared the Ebola epidemic a public health emergency of international concern, which is it also happened to be, it was international before August 2014, but it just so happens that 2 white Americans had gotten sick and were brought back to the United States. So the UN Security Council soon passed a resolution declaring the outbreak a threat to international security, which again coincided with uprisings in Monrovia against police presence in West Point, but also what was happening in Ferguson, Missouri. So when thousands of foreign military personnel were deployed to the region, many with an explicit mandate to not offer clinical and laboratory expertise that MSF requested, some observers worried that this rapid and massive deployment of troops reflected a securitized approach to health. And so under this securitized approach, vulnerable communities, particularly individuals with Ebola, are under siege by their governments and foreign militaries. And I'm expressing this on the basis of what survivors actually told me when I was interviewing them, or when one of my students was interviewing them about their early experiences. So people were being pursued, fleeing contact tracers, because what was happening is people were going into the facilities but not coming out. Their families were not notified. So suspected Ebola carriers were actively pursued with the threat of force to be detained and isolated from their families, often with little expectation of being cured or recovering. As a result, communities approached by military personnel or agents of the state supported by the threat of force that the state represents were likely to respond to public health outreach with fear, resistance, and even violence. And I've written about this, but there's been work by Sylvain Faye, who was in Guinea, and Wilkinson in Fairhead. So these feelings of fear and expressions of resistance and violence had negative implications for safety of health workers, their willingness and ability to offer assistance and education in Ebola-affected communities, as well as local communities' willingness to follow Byzantine and often contradictory public health rules. So what I'm also trying to get at here is the question of democratic institutions. And I'm hopefully going to get back to that point. But I've been thinking a lot about, over the past couple of days, about what this actually means for thinking about health, government health agencies as not only operating in transformative ways, producing transformative social policies, but what does it mean to democratize our thinking about public health, but also this move to, I think, what's accompanied or what's a part of this health security agenda, which is pandemic preparedness. So the health security regime paradigms, I called it, also starts to, so one of the preparedness issues is that if there is already suspicion of a health system, we're talking about, I'd say, further distrust. And that's something that I've been talking about with friends who work in the east of Sierra Leone. So part of the preparedness plan, as I mentioned before, is highly data intensive. And so you would be in clinics that had iPads and data surveillance technologies, but no medicines to treat people. So what does that mean when you're investing in surveillance, when you're investing in data planning, but not also building systems that are trustworthy? So if this can be a provocation for research and scholarship that examines the democratic institutions for health, it's important to think of how these discourses of biosecurity, particularly those focusing on global health security, emanating from places like the United States and the CDC, actively produce scales, so the global, and the sites, the Sentinel Clinic, quarantine, containment centers, through which they achieve their legitimacy and purpose. They also shape affect. This is me being an anthropologist, by the way, sorry. So to invoke the scale here is also to acknowledge the role that space and spatial relationships, physical, imagined, and symbolic, in the political, cultural, and social process of making, implementing, and analyzing policy. Thus, its attention to spatial patterns of clustering, dispersion, and expansion are crucial for understanding the effects of the GHSA. So when I said this is a provocation for I'm thinking about this, I'm also saying that rather than focus research on making states better at global health security or making them better prepared, what might it mean and where do you look when you're trying to think about actual social protection, actual reproduction. So in these looking at these spatial effects, I'm trying to also think not on the medicalization of security is one of the issues in the security, in addition to the securitization of health. So I know that sounds kind of esoteric, but one of the things I've been trying to think about is how the policy and how it's actually been implemented in Sierra Leone, where I work, is that you end up having, so they have these pillars organized around prevention, detection, and medical countermeasures, but nothing that's specifically about clinical care. I have about 3.5 minutes, so the one thing that I wanted to talk about was the pushback against this agenda, but to talk about that pushback against this agenda in a way that is to suggest that it wasn't an explicit pushback, it was a pushback against the use of funds during the Ebola pandemic. So I, in my abstract, mentioned the group of survivors who sued the government of Sierra Leone in regional court, in ECOWAS court, because they felt that upon reading the audit that was conducted at the end of 2014, they felt that the state had violated their right to health. That suit was filed in December 2017, but it was only recently adjudicated, I think 2023, and it was thrown out by the court. But what I wanted to point out was what they were able to do, and I think this is why I'm very interested in looking at the bottom-up approaches. Ebola survivors were saying that because money had been mismanaged, all of the money that had been donated to address Ebola could have been better used to build medical capacity, to improve health facilities, to treat people and make sure that they survive the illness. And I have many accounts of all of the ways that the best quality of care that was possible was not always provided, even when it was within reach of the facilities that were part of this, that were involved in providing treatment and care. So I just wanted to end with saying this was a bit of a slice of a longer set of engagements in which I'm trying to think about the embodied, interpersonal, and communal impacts of a global health security agenda and how people experience it, but also by exposing some of the more dangerous and embodied effects of a choiceless democracy, a country whose hands are tied in the development of a public health system that's supposed to be designed primarily to protect the interests outside of the state. So I'll end there. Thank you.
So yes, we have next Dr. Marion Ouma from the University of South Africa, who will tell us about the state and state policy making, social policy making reflections from Thandika Mkandawire. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for having me here. And it's an honor to speak in the same panel as my PhD supervisor, Professor Adesina, who's continued to be a mentor and a true mwalimu to me. And I think he believes in me more than I believe in myself at times. So it's really an honor to be here. So my research is on social policy, and I've been looking at policy making in particular, and how social policy making is done in Africa and in countries in the continent. And so I think Thandika writes and he says that for a long time, the African state has been criticized as weak, inefficient, and often its capability and capacity to provide public services comes into question. And the post-independent state is seen as underdeveloped, dependent, and also quite neo-colonial. And this is due to the neo-patrimonialism and a political capture that characterizes the state, that others say characterizes the state in Africa. And in terms of social policy, what this does is the cannibalization of the state has led us to further weakening of an already weak state in terms of social provisioning and social policy. And second, there have been calls for a minimal state, that the state needs to be, to minimize its role in terms of social policy and social provisioning, and to be a night watchman state, that which just enables the working of others, especially the market, in terms of the leader in social policy. And this has created room. What this has led to is a creation of room of indigenous ideas from outside, and actors in the policy-making spaces who then control the agenda in terms of what gets onto the policy space and the policy process in many countries. And I draw from the idea of choiceless democracy, which Thandika Mkandawire describes in the paper Crisis Management and Choiceless Democracies, building on what Adia has been speaking about. And what we see on the continent is a continuation in policy making of policies of SARS from 1970s, late 1970s, 80s, and 90s. And he describes choiceless democracy as a situation in policy making and the involvement, which involves external donors that constrain formal institutions of democracy. And Olukoshi goes further to describe this quite well, and he says, it's a situation where you have policies and ideas, policies that on key issues of the economy and society, which are completely out of the realm of public discourse and belong to a technocratic policy elite tied to a transnational structure. And in this case, then, governments find themselves in a place where they're not able to alter established neoliberal economic and social policy. And what follows is a loss of legitimacy as countries go into enforcing austerity. And fundamentally, in terms of democracy, is accountability shift from the citizens to donors. And we have a situation where decisions are based on donor influence rather than those on electoral demands. And I think this discussion started yesterday with Prof. Zeleza when he mentioned the linkage between democracy, social welfare, and social policy. And sites of policy making are actually also sites where we articulate and there is a fomenting of state-society contract. And citizens are able to gain accountability or extract accountability that exercise citizenship within the spaces of policy making and social policy. And politics also gets disciplined in this arena in the interest of commons. But also, when you talk about, and also social policy, in that sense, then social policy and democracy become mutually reinforcing. And here we also find that it's a site where the state then provides for the welfare of its needs, and also the state and citizens are able to cultivate space to foster democracy. But there is the potential that policy processes and policy making can undermine democratic principles, and I'll go and show that with a couple of examples from some countries, or some examples from the continent. So the first, in the paper, then Mkandawire talks about 3 levels of choicelessness in choiceless democracy. The first one is when choices are constricted to a particular solution that international organizations have imposed. basically solutionism. This is the solution to your problem, and so this is what you're going to do about it. But then there's also, second, there's the constraint of instruments where policies wielded by elected governments are blunted or captured by unelected international organizations. And lastly, the structural constraints related to financial factors. The first one I'll talk about is what we see as the new or the current social policy agenda that Prof. Adesina has mentioned, where broader social policy is constrained to social protection and further into cash transfers. And what this does for social policy, and this is a common feature across the continent in many countries that have adopted cash transfers in the last 30 years, Ghana, Kenya, Zambia, lots of countries on the continent. I think every country now has a sort of a cash transfer program going on. And these were basically imposed by, have been imposed by donor agencies in most countries, maybe besides South Africa and maybe Botswana and a few. These are programs that have been imposed, and basically it's a narrowing of social policy into the agenda of just give money to the poor, just give money to the poor and you're going to sort out all the problems that you have. But what this does, and you read the new poverty agenda, there's a paper that Mkandawire talks about the new poverty agenda, is there is now a focus on the protective function, just the protective function. We're just going to provide a safety net that then prevents people from falling further into poverty. And the agenda now is more welfare. It's about the welfare, more welfareistic tendencies and just the protective aspect of what rather than the other 5 aspects of what Professor Adesina was talking about. There's the neglect of other functions, for instance, the reproductive, and so on. It also ignores the asymmetrical relations of global capitalism and the neoliberal power structures, and treats poverty and inequality as a historical and not structural. And therefore, provision by the state has been reduced to selected categories of people. So it's the very severely disabled, for instance, and so on. And it's run by mantras that, silver bullet to poverty, just give cash to the poor, and so forth. An agenda that's neither transformative nor emancipatory. And this substitutes public provision, but also is the idea of monocropping. The second level is the constraint on policies, what Mkandawire terms as the constraint on policies and policies are blunted or captured. I think Malawi with the farm input subsidy program then is a good example of how this was done by international organizations, the IMF and the World Bank. And after severe drought and famine, then Malawi implemented the FISP, the FISP program, which faced a lot of resistance from donors, especially the IMF. And the question were on the government capability to provide universal program under the farm subsidy program, the sustainability of the program, but also the efficacy of it. And instead, the government was asked to look at other programs like the cash transfer, basically the cash transfer program. But, any government, the legitimacy of any government is usually tied with its ability to make food, and in this case, maize available. And the government, which was newly elected at that time, had to back down and on a universal program so as not to jeopardize relations with donors, especially the IMF, who they were going into plans of talking for new arrangement. But when the program was implemented, and Thandika writes quite well about this, and he said it turned Malawi from a perpetual food beggar to self-reliant nation, and with the implementation ending years of hunger and chronic food shortages. But then the government was forced to tamper down on its aspirations because of efficiency by the IMF and the World Bank. Recently, countries have found themselves in a place where they have been constrained. The third one, they have been constrained related to the financial factors. And Zambia and Kenya, when you look at the agreements, that the countries have signed over the last 2-3 years, you find the need to reestablish sustainability through fiscal adjustment and debt restructuring. And part of the conditionalities that these countries have been required to do is to eliminate subsidies, reform the regressive and wasteful subsidies. This I've picked up from the documents that are, IMF agreements between Kenya and also Zambia and IMF. Reduce the subsidies on agriculture and food, reduce poorly targeted public investment. So there's the whole idea of targeting rather than universalism, and the use of biometrics, the obligatory actually use of biometrics for the FISP in Zambia. There's the emphasis on cash transfers as priority social spending. And in Kenya, within the agreements, there's also the obligatory use of a digital social economic database. I mean, there's a whole politics about the single registry on the continent, and I think that's beyond this presentation, but it's interesting to see what it does and what it does not do, who it eliminates, who it excludes, and so forth. And also the IMF is asking governments to increase taxation. For instance, in Zambia, the government is being told to increase taxation on the rental income and so on. And the governments have committed, and they say, we'll do this, we'll target social spending, for instance. We will scale social cash transfer programs because the IMF and the World Bank want the safety nets to be expanded. We'll scale that. We commit to, the Zambian government says we commit to making FISP more effective with spending, but then say they're going to make it more effective, and what's happening? So they're being asked to reduce spending on it, and so Zambia has reduced the spending on FISP from 1.3. FISP is also a farm subsidy program. So spending on FISP is also going to be reduced from 1.3 to 0.9%. And ring-fence cash transfers. So the idea is still to bring back governments to that solution of cash transfers, and you can see this is where the focus is on. And what this has led is, I wouldn't be a true Kenyan if I didn't speak about the Gen Z protest, yeah? The Gen Z protest in Kenya, and the unmasking the puppet master. And there were lots of things that happened within the Gen Z protest in Kenya, but one of it was a pushback to the IMF and the World Bank, yeah? And people, and with the conditionalities and the new taxes that were coming in and so on. The protests were actually, part of it was against the IMF and the World Bank and the imposition that they were putting on the government, And it's interesting, the IMF recommendations, and what they say about this protest is actually the IMF was telling the state to ignore the anti-tax policies. When you read the argument, the recommendations by the IMF on the agreements that they sign, they actually tell the government that, there is the risk of political unrest, and the recommendation is to stick to the reforms, yeah? That's what they say, you can't read it, but actually the policy response is stick and stay on to the path of reforms for this despite the protest. Looking forward, what doesn't Mkandawire suggest for countries that find themselves in a place of choicelessness, yeah? Choiceless democracy? You have an elected government, but then because of the constraints that you have, you cannot be able to bring about the kind of social policy that you want. First of all is the idea of definable national social policies, which reflect the context rooted in the idea of transformative social policy. That's one part that countries need to look at. The second is policy sovereignty and autonomy, that governments and elected governments are allowed to pursue the kind of social policy that then fits within their paths. And lastly, that governments have to find other ways of financing to lessen donor dependency. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And now we have Professor Fiona Tregena from the University of Johannesburg, who's going to tell us about social policy, structural transformation, and industrial policy, a Thandika-inspired approach for South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm really thrilled to be here and to be part of this panel on social policy, which I must admit isn't actually my own area of focus. I'm more commonly found talking about structural transformation, industrialization, industrial policy, and so on. So how I came to talk about this at this conference is really an attempt to kind of ground and formalize some aspects of current economic policy debates in South Africa related to social policy and how it fits into a broader growth path, including its links with industrialization. And what triggered some of this thinking on my part, if I can reflect on a meeting which I was part of on formulating economic policy for South Africa, in which one of my interventions was around advocating for a universal basic income grant. I then got a flood of WhatsApp messages and pushback and so on from people in the meeting, along the lines of, no, Comrade Fiona, we need you to focus on industrial policy. This thing is going to take money away from industrial policy. Social grants are unproductive. People need jobs, not handouts. Leave this thing to NGOs. It's too social democratic. That's intended from a left perspective. Stick to your lane. Now, perhaps they needed to read Thandika, because, of course, for Thandika, social policy and industrial policy are not two different lanes. Thandika's view, I think, has been very well set out by Jimi, amongst others, and in fact, my presentation follows, I think, well from Jimi's. So I'll just be brief on that, but I think the key thing of Thandika's perspective on social policy is that it goes far beyond social protection. It's about transformative social policy that plays a productive role in the development process. And for example, when he looks at East Asia, he points to the role of social policy as the handmaiden of rapid industrialization. And he identifies three particular links between social policy and industrial policy. One, in terms of the kind of the dislocations and strains brought about by rapid industrialization and the role of social policy in that regard. Secondly, the role of social policy in building up the social capabilities for industrialization. And then thirdly, in the financing of industrialization. I think this debate around the links between social policy and broader growth and development is particularly relevant to South Africa, where we're facing a crisis of social reproduction. And I want to illustrate South Africa's crisis of social reproduction with reference to the issue of stunting, childhood stunting. So in South Africa, our official data indicates that more than a quarter of children under 5 years old are stunted. So literally, they're not growing properly because of inadequate food. And there's clear medical evidence that children who experience this kind of stunting in the first 5 years of life are unlikely to ever catch up, even if they have enough plentiful nutrition later, and that these effects carry forward even into adulthood. South Africa is not a poor country. we're an upper middle income country. How can anybody think it's okay as an upper middle income country to have over a quarter of children literally stunted? And for me, it brings home the urgency of dealing with this crisis of social reproduction. Because literally every year that goes by without us dealing with extreme poverty has long-lasting effects on people's lives. So we can't just say that, okay, let's grow our way out of it, even in a neoclassical way, or even from a more structuralist perspective to say, yes, let's just have structural transformation, industrialize, and so on. Even if it takes a decade, but there's literally people's lives being changed in the interim. And I think linking this to South Africa's transition more broadly, this year we are celebrating 30 years of democracy. And while there have been fundamental changes, fundamental progress, we've clearly fallen short. We speak in South Africa of the triple challenges: poverty, inequality, unemployment. But it's actually euphemistic to call them triple challenges. They're actually triple crises. And some of these limitations of the transition have been partially managed by the extensive rollout of services, of infrastructure and social grants. And in fact, these grants have perhaps prevented society from imploding. Can you put the slide? Can you go to the next one? So if we look at South Africa, it has some commonalities with other middle-income countries. We have some ways in which we're atypical, but more premature deindustrialization and so on. And then we have aspects in which we are really an outlier. So here I just want to demonstrate it just in relation to poverty. What I've plotted here, I'm just going to go through the chart quite quickly. This is just a cross-country comparison. Each dot is representing a country. Here I've just plotted extreme poverty. It's an absolute measure. It's not a relative measure. It's an absolute measure. And here it's simply GDP per capita. So we can see here South Africa, a bit of an outlier. These countries over here are the countries with higher poverty than South Africa. But these are really, really poor countries. These are the lowest income countries. These ones over here are a lot poorer than South Africa. In some cases, about a quarter, a half of South Africa's income per capita. Yet, they all have lower poverty, lower absolute poverty levels than South Africa. These ones over here are the countries with similar levels of income per capita as South Africa. Yet their poverty levels are a fraction of those of South Africa. Not saying that everything is fine in these countries, they still have poverty. But this is, it's not normal, but it's the typical levels of absolute poverty in countries of South Africa's level of development. And yet we're out there. The difference between this, and as I say, it's certainly not saying that the poverty in these countries is fine, but this is the typical levels. We're a country of about 60 million people. The difference between where we actually are and where other countries of similar levels of income per capita is, it's the equivalent of about 10 million people in poverty. That even if there was the normal kind of, normal quote-unquote, typical levels of income distribution, would otherwise not be in poverty. So what does it mean in terms of our economic policy debates and kind of thinking through more broadly a structuralist perspective? I think I will control the slides, if that's okay. So here I've just outlined a kind of a broad structuralist perspective on growth and development, which puts here I'm talking about structuralism as in Prebisch, Chenui, Hirschman, Furtado, and so on, which puts emphasis on structural change, leading to growth, and with the addition of some kind of targeted development interventions, anti-poverty measures, and so on, leading to improved development outcomes. Interestingly, if we look at Thandika, although I would say he broadly fell within a structuralist tradition, but he also departed a bit from this approach in terms of his thinking on social policy. If we come to the case of South Africa, we can't grow our way out of poverty. Even, I think broadly development thinking, even of the international financial institutions and so on, now recognizes that growth isn't enough. But particularly in a country like South Africa, it's literally not feasible to grow our way out of poverty. Number one, the extreme levels are such that even if we model different growth rates, improving the growth rates a bit or whatever, it could at best take decades and decades, if ever, to eradicate poverty simply through growth. And secondly, perhaps in terms of the more causal relationships, the extreme levels of not only poverty but unemployment and inequality are themselves actually a binding constraint on growth. I won't have time to talk about why, we can talk about it later, but the extremeness of these levels are actually a barrier to not only higher growth rates, but even to changing the character of that growth. So in South Africa, I think there's a kind of a low-level equilibrium trap in which these triple crises, growth rates, and the structure of the economy actually feed into each other. So it's not just that, okay, growth isn't enough, hence we're having these problems. The degree of inequality, of unemployment and poverty are actually also constraining that. So, yeah, having outlined this kind of broad structuralist approach, I think in South Africa, yeah, there's a need for a different kind of thinking, which actually, we need to think through a different growth path that is not just about raising growth, which we're also failing in any case, to changing the productive structure of the economy, and to one which sees, for example, the mass creation of employment and changing the distributional structure of the economy as part of that growth path, rather than just as outcomes. And I'm running out of time, so I think there are two broad implications of this. One, which I'm not going to even touch on at all, is the implications for industrial policy and which sectors to target. A second one, which I'm just going to only briefly be able to touch on, is around the implications for social policy. So I think if South Africa had kind of typical upper middle income levels of poverty, inequality, unemployment, even then, and for other developing countries, social policy still has an important developmental role to play. I certainly don't want to leave an impression that, it's only important for a strange country like South Africa. But in those other upper middle income countries, people are better able to sustain themselves at some level with earnings from work than in the case of South Africa. We can think of two kind of broad, and these are really non-exclusionary routes to more inclusive or equitable outcomes in a market economy. I'm limiting this to debates and changes within a market economy. Firstly, transform the productive structure. so that more people get earnings from work and that earnings from work are more equitably distributed. So here we're talking about structural transformation, mass job creation, changing the wage profit split, or we can think of it in terms of changing the rate of surplus value, closing the wage gap, and so on. So changes in the productive structure of the economy. And secondly, redistributing income post-production to raise the incomes of those without earnings or with earnings too low to meet their basic needs, so including, for example, social grants. And these two pathways are not mutually exclusive, of course. It's not either or, that's the point. And I think for many people coming from a kind of structuralist tradition or also from a broader leftist background, the natural inclination, and we see this in the debates in South Africa, the natural inclination is often to the first of these, to trying to change the productive structure, because there's an inclination to say, no, social grants are a bit NGO-ish, they're a bit social democratic, and so on. Yet in South Africa, we've had 3 decades to change the productive structure. We haven't been able to do it. And part of the difficulty with that is that the levers of changing the productive structure aren't under the direct control of the state. They depend on many actors, including capital. Redistributing income post-production, including, for example, through social grants, basic income grant, is sometimes seen as an easier option in a negative sense. Oh, and it's too easy. But it has direct effects. And to come back to what I talked about at the beginning in terms of stunting, maybe we can't wait a decade or two to change the productive structure if we would even get there. So I'll wrap up. I can see you're getting anxious there. Yeah, maybe just to try and bring it together very briefly, is that in South Africa, we need this change in productive structure, but that needs to be complemented with a redistribution of income post-production. Because changing the productive structure, it takes time, you don't have it all under state control and so on. And I think it's not limited to South Africa, again. I think this applies for other developing countries as well, but far more so in the case of South Africa, an upper middle income country with levels of poverty, malnutrition and so on that are like a low income country. So social policy and industrial policy is not either or. And I think this brings out some of the contemporary relevance of Thandika's thinking to economic policy debates. Of course, there's choices to be made about resource allocation in a fiscally constrained environment, what. But broadly, I'm talking about growth paths here. And trying to think through a growth path and policy choices in which we can both change that productive structure as well as use social policy and get beyond this binary of productive versus so-called non-productive. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you also, Professor Jimi. I hope you are still with us. Now we have time for discussion, and also as a discussant, I will start here with a few comments, questions to our panelists. And before I give you, to all our panelists, a chance to respond, I would like to also seize the opportunity and take a first round of questions right after my comments. That way, if you want to answer by tackling a group of questions together, you could do that. So yes, I'll open right after for a round of questions, maybe 2, 3, and if we have more time, we can go for a second round. So I really enjoyed this panel. It was so thought-provoking. Thank you so much. This is such a needed work. And I really liked also all the synergies that we've been hearing about analysis and research. I would like to start in the order. So, Professor Jimi, you gave a really thoughtful homage to Thandika's seminal work, and also thank you for building on his important contribution of transformative social policy by adding to it. So in engaging with your paper, I had a series of questions that I hope you can maybe react to. So first, you mentioned that a number of countries in the African continent, in their maldevelopment, are sort of trapped between the Bandung development and the Truman development. So to me, I was wondering if your argument is also trying to say something about the choice of these countries regarding their militarization. So for the Bandung model, we had there different currents. So one that was sort of more promoting demilitarization, and others promoting sovereign military capacity. So in the case of the Truman Doctrine, there is more of an outsourcing of the military capacity to the US, right? So sort of that building of that dependence. So here, another formulation of my inquiry, how were development models in our continent designed with military concerns in mind? Second, you added an important pillar to the principles of transformative social policy, so the social cohesion and nation building as well. I was wondering how that could apply specifically, and here I'm taking the opportunity, since we are launching our university, to maybe probe you on maybe an implementation through education of this social cohesion. So maybe an example of decolonizing the curriculum, the pedagogy, and what could that look like. Lastly, sort of highlighting of dignity to me is really resonant as a conclusion. So based on Mwalimu Nyerere's great contributions. So there, on thinking of how social policy can maybe add more to that need of human dignity. So I was wondering what could be maybe the additions to achieve that, to better tackle that. So for instance, the HDI, the Human Development Index, sort of attempted to do that through health, income levels, and education, but maybe if there is something additional. Professor Adia, fantastic research. I think it's very important to sort of maybe highlight, I think, a form of cognitive dissonance in policy making in the many cases in the continent. So, for instance, how healthcare, as you said, maybe pretends to serve local interests when it's actually geared right towards external ones. So my question is regarding examples of maybe some of those surveillance measures, right? So to track disease, for disease control, and how sort of it constitutes that sort of health security threat. You mentioned the Lassa fever in Sierra Leone, right? So the sharing, so was there sharing of patients' data with international organizations, US organizations? And I think there also what was to me very important is showing how those everyday experiences are forms of insecurity, right? So and how there is a form of harm beyond the medical records, right? So also in terms of the GA, so the Global Health Security Agenda, GSA, and to me, I mean, you already talked about securitization, but it drew me back to the 1994 Human Development Report, right? And this sort of shift in towards the development security nexus, right? So here Professor Adesina talked about the social policy development nexus. We had that added, right? And so to me, I was wondering if in even that formulation, right, of how the Ebola crisis, right, in the UN was for the first time at the Security Council presented as this threat to international peace, right? So really this use of terms. So how that actually is even hiding sort of a reverse order of things, right? So actually the threat is the other way around, right? So because we also need to connect it to economic insecurity, structural insecurity in these countries because of here the intervention of these foreign actors. And again, there quickly, the 2014, as you described, I think is also quite resonant with 2011 and the migrant crisis, right? And we had there a lot of literature on the securitization of borders. Yes, so I was wondering if there are also maybe there parallels with sort of taking away in this medical securitization, also the mobility securitization, right? Because of the containment of the disease. Thank you, Dr. Marion. So, fascinating work, and I really liked here how you present a real concern about the vacuum in state involvement in social policy, in many examples in the continent, and how it's filled by these transnational actors who are ill-equipped, as you mentioned. So here I just had maybe a note or a concern in general of me being specific about the African cases, and because, of course, the continent is not a monolith. So I was wondering if maybe it could be helpful to delve more in specific cases as opposed to really tackling so many and talk about the African sort of example or examples of social policy. To me, how you dealt with the land reform in Zimbabwe and the farm input subsidy program in Malawi were really sort of speaking, right, to that sort of alternative, particularly to cash transfers, of improvements in social policy that is geared to local needs. So I was wondering there if maybe we can even think about using a Thandika matrix in evaluating social policies, maybe systematically, right? So for instance, taking those two countries, those examples of policies, and seeing how they fare, right, in terms of how much can they qualify as not just social policies, but transformative social policies based on a matrix. And regarding the cash transfers, and I definitely share here your, hesitation with them and how they are problematic, because, right, they translate here this lack of also contextualizing, right, the social problems. So to me, I was also maybe needing a bit more of maybe insight on how we can anticipate resistance to stopping, right, or limiting cash transfers from local communities, right? Because often I think they are seen as a quick fix, right? So I was wondering maybe we could be wrong, right? So maybe a survey of how, let's say, if we, let's say, move from a regime of cash transfers to a set of new policies, how much maybe the local communities would be on board. Yes. Thank you, Professor Fiona. I really enjoyed the paper and how comprehensive it was in explaining better pathways to industrial policy in South Africa, and I liked also the focus on South Africa. And it's of course fascinating how it's, as you mentioned, a category on its own, right? As a middle-income country with those challenges, crises, as you added, of inequality, poverty, and employment. So there, I have just 2 quick questions. So first, regarding opting for a mixed approach in industrialization, right? And you mentioned having both labor-intensive industries and non-labor-intensive ones. What would that look like, right? So what would be these industrial sectors that fulfill such a mix? And you also mentioned, I note here how to have also a variety mixed financing, right? So both public and private, which I think is convincing in terms of a maybe more realistic gradual approach to here a development strategy for the country. In describing, so the second and last point, in describing the uniqueness of South Africa's development issues, I was wondering how much the ethnic determinants, the status determinants, so as in legal status, for instance, nationals, residents, migrant workers, refugees, are also influential in making that uniqueness, and if there are maybe social policies that target these particular marginalized groups. And now I'll open the floor for questions. Yes, please. We can have a first round.
Thank you. My name is Sandile from the University of Johannesburg. My first question is to Prof. Adesina, right? In one of the charts that he displayed in his presentation in terms of the social policy that we must adopt as Africa going forward, there is protectionism, right? And I wanted to sort of ask him if is it still relevant as as a social policy or an industrial policy instrument, right? Given the developments, global economic developments over the past 20 years or so with the World Trade Organization and stuff, and that if he thinks it's still relevant, is it the traditional instruments of protectionism like high tariffs and non-tariff barriers in order to protect infant industries, are they still relevant? Because to a certain extent, countries must still comply with organizations such as the WTO. That is the first question. The second question is to Prof. Trajana. It's not personal, Prof. The question is, firstly, in South Africa, right? When you look at the levels of inequality, as you've said it before, they are quite extreme, right? The wealth of the country is within, a percentage of around 5% of the population, if I'm not mistaken, or exaggerating it, but it's within a few, it's concentrated within a few. And if you follow the cash, right, or their resources, they tend to go more into the stock market, right, into the financial sector as compared to the productive sectors. Essentially, they are not a reliable ally in your efforts of trying to structurally transform the economy. And my question is, how radical are we willing to be in the South African context, right, with local capital and global capital, such as your multinational enterprises, who have proven over the past 30 years or so that they are not interested in structurally transforming the South African economy. Do you go as far as nationalizing, I know, are we willing to be that radical or not? And my second question, I just have a few questions because these were really quite interesting presentations, so please bear with me. My second question is that, when it comes to, social policy, can we design it in such a way that it supports our structural transformation, aspirations? For example, when you speak about social policy, people tend to think of, just cash transfers. Can you design them in a certain way? For example, let's say a voucher component, right? Because in the South African economy, it's few companies that dominate, for example, the retail sector. You give people cash transfers, they go and spend within the same companies who are not going to structurally transform the company, the economy, but they're going to take that money and take it to the financial sector and invest in stocks and stuff. So eventually that money, you are just sending it to these people, but it does not change the structure of the economy, and it goes into the, and they keep on getting richer and stuff. Maybe making, voucher components of some sort that force the citizens to sort of buy in SMMEs and stuff that are much more willing to. So how do you design the social policy that is aimed at alleviating poverty and stuff? And then my last question is to Marion Oma, the last one, I promise. Again, in your presentation, when it comes to policy, it seems to me, as you are problematizing the policy issues, right? It seems like the key, problem, right? The underlying problem is institutions such as your IMF and your World Banks, right? I'm sorry to name drop. Again, the question is, how radical are we willing to be, right? Are we going to continue problematizing and complaining about them, or should African countries just completely stop participating in them? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. My name is Kiro. I'm from the University of Johannesburg. My first question, of course, goes to Professor Tregena there. We are in the fourth industrial revolution. I would like to find out exactly what role can technology and innovation play in facilitating structural transformation. Yeah, to me, structural transformation actually is something which is relevant for most African countries in order to create the much needed jobs for our young ones or for the populations. And then the second one, it goes to our two professors there. I would like to find out exactly what kind of social policies should African governments or countries adopt or put in place in order to address the poverty levels that we continue to see across the continent. Unfortunately, this poverty level actually is skyrocketing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, maybe one last question. And then, yeah.
Thank you so much to all of you. I have two or three points. My name is Emery. I work here at the Africa Institute. So the first one, I think it seems to me that what we have, the problem that we have in Africa is not necessarily the lack of social policy, but rather we have the crisis of implementation. Because we've produced so much work, but we don't necessarily, implement them. So here, the example will be Lumumba. We take Lumumba, if we take Lumumba seriously, so we'll understand that he had 2 points that he made. So first, in his, I wouldn't call it ideology, but he had a critique of colonialism, which can be framed as a politics of death. So he wanted to replace it with the politics of life, which had 5 components. So it's a politics that prioritized first the collective emancipation, the dignity which Zaynab mentioned, freedom, equality, and the protection of life. But these things has not been implemented. If you take the case of the Congo, so that's the problem. So the second point has to do with statistics. In one of the presentations, I think Professor Fiona, so you show us, graphics with many statistics. So I want to know what was the process of compiling those statistics and where they came from. Because in certain countries, again, the Congo, for instance, we don't produce statistics. And if we do, these statistics are not accurate. But in some other countries, let's say Rwanda, it has been shown that there's manipulation of statistics in terms of in regard to poverty. So how did you come up with these figures, so that you could get to that conclusion? And lastly, the question of social grant in South Africa, there's always a critique, but I wonder to what extent that critique is right, because if you look at in many countries in Europe, they still pay the unemployed. In France, if you don't have a job, so we still qualify to, I know it's changing now, but you still qualify to get, some sort of grant. It might begin with, let's say, 100 euros, and then the more you are unemployed, the more that's, grant also, the more, diminished. So I think these are the 3 points that I wanted to put on the table.
Thank you. So I will give you a chance, and maybe we can have another round if you have more questions. Maybe I'll go in the order of the presentations. Professor Jimi, if you want to maybe start.
Thank you very much. Excellent set of questions, and thank you for your role as discussants. I must confess that I haven't thought of the issue of the Bandung and Truman in terms of militarization. The emphasis in the Bandung principles, conceptions of development is rapid transformation of the economy, the distancing from colonialism and colonial bondage, a more equitable global system. But what Thandika will insist on, development as catch-up, but not as mimicry. It really, I don't think it matters particularly well whether we're dealing with, the militarization, in this, there's the important part of national, defense, but there are, countries that, Mauritius, an example, which doesn't have a standing army, and which has pursued a largely social democratic approach to, social policy and a developmental state, agenda. But it's something that I'll need to look at it in a second sense, The issue of social cohesion and the one of education, principally, it's the examples that I've drawn have been from Tanzania and Nigeria, where the design of the admission policy in the educational system, especially secondary school level and tertiary level, have been deliberately designed, the admission policy had been deliberately designed to help address parochial ethnic, identities, and foster a new national identity. The colleagues in Tanzania who spoke about, growing up in a context in which the children from the southern part were moved to the northern part, for their, secondary school education, and engage with communities. And the idea is that, you draw people from various parts of the country together in a single school, and help to foster a national identity. At the same time that education itself plays the role of enhancing human capacity, human capital, skills, and so on and so forth. In the case of Nigeria, it's what they call the Unity School, which were established immediately after the Civil War, and the whole idea was that it was the compartmentalization of peoples in terms of ethnic an ethnic identity, that and you had the federal government's secondary schools that were designed in such a way that you will have within the same school children drawn from various parts of the country and different ethnic identities. And I remember a friend, the late Rauf Mustafa, who was saying if there's any problem in Nigeria, he knows who to go to. And I said, what do you mean by that? He said, well, I went to school with them, and so on and so forth. The whole idea of the National Youth Service program in the Nigerian context was again designed to build into a nation building agenda, and so on and so forth. And I think at the heart of any socially conscious development agenda and social policy has to be the concept of human dignity. And I quoted Mwalimu just as an anchor for that. Because ultimately, when we talk about poverty, when we talk about unemployment, when we talk about, we're talking about issues of human dignity. And it is possible to have rapid development, which does not address the question of the mass, the experience of the mass of the people, and then you end up with a socially fractious environment, and so forth. On Sandile's question, the social protection the protection that we're talking about as a task of social policy is social protection. And it's important to disabuse people's mind that transformative social policy is not, it's not about, that you cannot have income transfer. You do. The point is the extent to which this has been within the context of very residual social protection framework, the reduction of social provisioning to people going to the market to meet their social provision needs and desire. So this is not about the question of trade tariffs and so on and so forth. It's about social protection, and it ranges. And in Thandika Mkandawire's, phrasing of it, protection from the vagaries of the market and the life cycle. From the prenatal, to old age, and design the social protection framework in such a way that it protects against the vagaries of the market and the life circumstances. I think I'll stop at that, because I think the other questions were not specifically addressed to me. But I look forward to the next cycle of
Thank you.
questions.
Thanks. Professor Adia? I think you can just talk, no?
It says it's on, but it's not. Or, oh wait, now it's working. I think maybe it. So, wow. So obviously there's a lot that I had to leave out of this. One of the things that I was actually having a conversation with my student's mentor when she went to Sierra Leone, and her mentor was one of the military doctors working on the project, and he says to me on the phone, he says, I think you'll be happy to know I just got out of my global health security training, in which they were learning how to better document cases that might come in for different kinds of diseases in the reporting systems, but particularly how the military might be involved. When I talked about surveillance measures, those, there's disease surveillance, which is very much like the language of public health from the 1950s onward, which was a kind of a Cold War construction. The idea that you will be able to collect intelligence on epidemics before they start, and you can protect the nation via these systems. But it's become a more standardized approach, and so when I talk about surveillance, I'm talking about that. But there is another component that is so cell phone data, for example, trying to track people's movements, that was actually used in Sierra Leone. One of the issues with that was, of course, that some people don't have phones, or some people have 3 phones, or whatever, or they leave them to charge. So another challenge is the burden of data collection for health workers who are already burdened. If they're having to collect all of these data and have certain kinds of reporting mechanisms to different donors and their government, it shapes the nature of their labor. They're confronted with having this burden while also not being able to complete the other kind of work that they normally have, which is caring for patients, right? I really liked that statement, the colonialism as a politics of death. I see the extension of various some things like the health security agenda as a politics of truncated life. Because many of them they're thinking about health and public health and public health programming only in terms of preparedness and threats, rather than understanding health and health systems as sustaining life. I go back and forth on whether I actually believe or want to think about just being productive citizens, right? Like supporting life so that people can produce, but that is so they can be productive and reproductive. But it is important to think about the extent to which the existing health system, so I'm speaking largely about Sierra Leone, but I think it applies in many cases, health systems that don't serve the people or only serve specific populations because those are the targets. So for example, I tell people the sort of global health system only cares about you if you're from 0 to 5, and then only women from 15 to 49. If you're an older woman, and other women, well, and what about men, and what about people who between the ages of 6 and 14 who are not reproducing, or older women, or whatever. Which isn't to say that those services are not available. It's just that the bulk of resources is about managing cost effectiveness, getting the biggest bang for the buck. So what does that structure do? I think a politics of truncated life is what it is. A lot of these metrics are tied to funding. So I discovered only this morning that the Biden administration, its pandemic fund for helping to finance responses to outbreaks and preparedness is tied to the Global Health Security Agenda Index, whether people have a plan based upon, whether countries have a plan based upon this agenda, which again is very much focused on detection and to some extent not care, clinical care, but medical countermeasures. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about the medicalization of security. People have to become agents of preparedness. So what is, ultimately that's what it means. I think that's it. Oh, you had that comment about migrant crisis. migrant crisis. The crisis is for the Europeans, right? Not the people migrating. So that's part. I think that's part of the story. In the book, I think I do talk about the British government. All of these different governments sort of created these little videos, 30-second videos that were on YouTube that were animating. They're showing like a person getting on a plane or arriving on the shores, and they were trying to say, you're not really at risk if these people come because we have a great health system. We're going to be able to do this. Yeah, it was very weird. I don't know what to do with it except to say that it's yet another example of how this agenda is an explicit agenda about protecting the U.S. or the U.K. or whatever. Yeah, I think that's all I have.
Thank you. Thanks. Dr. Marion. I think if...
Oh.
Okay, good.
Okay.
It's working.
Okay, thank you, Zaynab,
Thank you.
for the questions and suggestions too. And I think transformative social policy itself can and has been used as an evaluative framework, You talk about a metric that we could use to qualify, different social policies. And the works of some of my colleagues at the Statute Chair on Social Policy, especially on land reforms in Zimbabwe, the contested and land reforms, then look at social land reforms itself as a social policy instrument and how transformative it is with, for women, men, and different populations, the youth. And so even the idea of transformative social policy itself is an evaluative framework that can be used to study the extent to which different policies are transformative or transformative social policy. I think I draw from a number of countries because just to use them as an example of what happens in terms of choiceless democracy. So these countries that I draw from, Kenya, Zambia, and Malawi, and the different levels that Thandika talks about in terms of choicelessness, I use them to show how this choicelessness, these are democratically elected governments that come into power, but then how this choicelessness plays out in different countries. You could look at it, you could use one country as an example, but I think the multiple example just shows how much the international organizations have a foothold in many countries on the continent, and I thought maybe that would be important, but could be used only for one country. Sanile asks, how radical are we going to be how radical? I don't know. I think that's a question that we have to ask ourselves here. But then it brings to mind also, Samira means delinking, and to what extent, as a continent, we are able to do that, and we are willing to go that way. Taking into consideration that we are in a globalized world, and you know, we operate within a globalized world. So how do we do that? How do we create different centers of power? You know, is it just different centers of powers and so on? And there was a question on what kind of social policies should African governments adopt? I'm not going to be prescriptive and say transformative social policy, maybe, but I think it's policies that play many functions, not just one, yeah? Policies that go beyond just protecting, providing a safety net, yeah? There have to be policies that are redistributive, intentionally redistributive, protective, they're protective, they are going to spur production, and so on. So there are policies that need to play multiple functions, yeah? Social policy that reaches large populations of people and not just specific or you know, targeted groups of people. They have to be universal in nature, reaching large populations. They need to draw from what Professor Adesina says, a repertoire of instruments, not just one instrument, as is a tendency for most countries, you know, safety net, what the World Bank is promoting, and the IMF, safety net. It needs to be, there are many instruments that can draw from, you know, land reforms being one of them, yeah, as a social policy instrument. So African governments need to look at social policy, a large number of social policy instruments to promote well-being. They need to be, I mean, very redistributive in nature. Here the issue of South Africa, where you have large, a huge inequality. And so they need to be policies that then are intentionally redistributive in nature. Education and health, universal education, health, and healthcare being, I mean, the ones that come to mind, you know. Land reforms in countries, especially like where the land question is still there. Kenya, I mean, Zimbabwe has been sorted in a way, you know, South Africa, yeah? Land reforms being a key redistributive, can be a key redistributive instrument. And also social policy instruments that seek, or social policy in a way, pursued in a way that then promotes the well-being and dignity of the population, as Prof. Adesina said. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks for the great questions. Let me first start with those from Professor Zaynab. Thanks for asking about this mixed approach to the targeting and industrial policy. It's in the paper, but I completely skipped it over because of time in the presentation. And I will also bring Kiru's question into this. So I think, yeah, my argument here is to say, even from a broad structuralist approach, what are the ways in which that needs to be adjusted or modified for a country with the specificities such as South Africa? One way is a stronger role for social policy. Another way is with respect to which sectors and activities to target in industrial policy, as you were asking in your question. I think the general thrust of a kind of a structuralist approach to industrial policy puts the focus on upgrading of sectors and activities towards higher productivity sectors and those with greater scope for cumulative productivity increases, so more technologically advanced and so on, as the general thrust of catching up. In a case such as South Africa, with the unemployment rates that we have, it's not viable to simply only focus on those kind of sectors for industrial policy, more high-tech, more capital-intensive sectors, because of the extent of unemployment. At the same time, I disagree with some of the arguments to say focus only on the most labor-intensive sectors to mop up unemployment. Yes, it might do that, but it's a dead end in terms of growth and development, because you might mop up some of that unemployment in the short term, but you fall further and further behind in a development perspective. So our industrial policy needs a greater mix of sectors to target, both the kind of more traditional high productivity sectors as well as those more labor intensive. Of course, you can't target everything because then it's no longer targeting. But what it does imply as well is a kind of expanded scope for industrial policy with this sort of hybrid mix of sectors, including Kiru, as you have raised, around those using more frontier technologies. Professor Zaynab's second question is around the link with migrant workers. Yes, South Africa has high numbers of migrants, both the documented and undocumented. But this is not the source of these triple crises that we're facing in South Africa. That's about the structure of the economy and the failures of the transition. I think the way I would answer it is looking at one of the manifestations of this crisis of social reproduction has been in xenophobia, and specifically Afrophobia. Our unemployment rate, even the narrow rate, is around 33%. The expanded rate over 40%, the official data. One of these manifestations has been, as I said, xenophobia, but with an Afrophobic character specifically. And I think it's symptomatic of the kind of social implosion that there can be unless there's a fundamental change. Which brings me, I guess, to Sandele's point. How radical are we willing to be? Let's talk about it. But you made an observation that capital has shown that they're not kind of interested in this sort of project of social transformation or structural transformation. Yeah, I think capital will never be interested in that. It's not the interests, neither domestic or international. So within a market economy, it's about disciplining capital. What are the tools for that? It's too big a question to go into more. I see the clock is ticking. But I think it links also with your second question around the kind of connections between social policy and structural transformation. It's a great question. And I see it as going both pre-production, the productive sphere, and the post-productive sphere, or we can think of it in terms of the spheres of production and circulation. And there are various of these links. I'm trying to get away from this kind of linear approach that the one leads to the other. Social policy is important for building the capabilities for structural transformation. At the same time, where you've got a concentrated structure of the economy, as you mentioned, and with barriers to entry, how do you ensure that social policy, of course, the primary purpose is to bring human dignity, to meet people's basic needs and so on, but you also wanted to have that stimulating effect on the economy. So that entails also changing those patterns of ownership and control so that that relationship is actually strengthened. I think the growth path of the last 3 decades has fallen far short. So it's not about incremental changes. And there's also no panacea. Today, I've talked about social policy, but I wouldn't want to leave the impression that, this is the only solution. It's much broader than that. And lastly, very briefly, on the issue of statistics, absolutely critical. Not to take statistics at face value. Maybe we can talk more outside about the technicalities of the data and so on. But basically, the data which I used in that chart is from the WDI. All countries up to $20,000 per capita for which income is. For which data is available. Certainly, there are inconsistencies, and some countries cook the data, and there's poor collection, missing data, and so on. I think what I was trying to show there is a broad picture, and even if we adjust for that, South Africa is clearly an outlier. But we can talk more about the data details.
All right. Thank you so much for making the time.